And we are now recording. Great. So, and we're getting, as soon as I press it, there's like 6 more people we're admitting into. So,
just Rick Keller just joined us, John.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you everybody for being here. We'll go ahead and get started. People will be admitted as we come in. We just want to be sure that we get a good start on this, so we're respectful of everybody's time, respectful of the panelists who've agreed to be part of this discussion and be part of this event today. So introductions, of course, are in order. My name is Tim Swinski. I am the communications manager for the Sierra Club Virginia chapter. So just a quick distinction, this event is hosted by one of our groups. Paul Kopowitz and John Bloom are really the host, and have just asked me as the communications person to come moderate. Yeah, so I'm excited.
We need to give a lot of credit to Dean Amel, who is actually the one who arranged this program and who, for personal reasons, couldn't be with us tonight.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you. Big believer in making sure that credit is given to those who have put a lot of work in for it. And I can assure you, Dean has done an extraordinary amount of work for this. So thank you again for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started with the program. And I just want to start off with some norms and expectations about what to expect throughout this. So the purpose of the event, of course, is to have a dialogue with the community and not draw a line. We are going to take your questions through the chat. We will take all of your questions and concerns and comments seriously, so that we can provide as much clarity as possible. We encourage everyone to utilize that chat feature. We just to avoid any bad feedback or any accidental disruptions. You will be muted throughout, but we will get to your questions and comments as much as we can. We want to be responsive to everyone who's participating in this. So please remember that if you ask multiple questions, we might not be able to get to all of them for the same purpose, for the same person, because we're going to be prioritizing everyone's concerns and perspectives. So please be patient with us throughout. We will be taking questions. You can chat questions into the comment box as much. Myself, Paul, and John are going to be monitoring the questions, and we will be highlighting for the speakers. And after each speaker is done speaking, we will have some questions around clarity, but most of the questions will be in the discussion component at the end of the event. I think it's also fair to note that the subject matter of tonight brings up a lot of strong feelings from people. Infill development and urban density brings up a lot of different opinions and passion from folks. And, regardless if those feelings are warm or cold, strong feelings are a good thing, because that means people care. They care about what happens to their community. They care about what happens to their neighbors, and they care about what happens to their homes. But I can promise you, the reason we're putting on this event is because we care too. We want people to be informed and empowered from the topics and discussions that we're going to be having today. And I think it's important to note that everyone here who's participating in this is doing it during a busy time in the holiday, and also are doing it for free. This is a volunteer-driven event, and so we want to make sure that the purpose of this event is respected, and that we can all have a community robust discussion around this issue. And make no mistake, if we do find that people are being disruptive, we may need to remove them from the meeting, but we don't think that is going to come to that. I think that we certainly don't have any plans to do that. We just want to make sure that as long as we're having a dialogue, as long as it's civil, then we're going to be game to engage. So we'll jump right into it. A little bit of context around this. In 2019, the Sierra Club produced a new policy on infill policy. And earlier this year, we published a lengthy guidance for how to interpret infill policy in different communities. Some folks wonder why an organization that has historically been on the front lines of conservation would deal with a policy on infill development. And the quickest answer is, frankly, it's population growth. The U.S. population is expected to grow by 25% over the next few decades. And that is going to amount to about 82 million people. The reality of population growth creates a fork in the road of urban planning and housing development. The Sierra Club does oppose urban sprawl and unmitigated and unregulated rural development, mostly because they oftentimes take place in forests. We interpret infill development as the right choice for any of the tough decisions we have to make in the future. It is a way that you're going to hear from the panelists today that we can reduce pollution, increase equity, and ensure that people are put first when it comes to urban planning. I will say that an additional consideration for urban infill policy is equity. The club supports development policies that offer affordable housing to everyone, expanded opportunities for all residents to participate in the local economy and civic decisions, living wage jobs, and balance between employment opportunities and housing. The reality is that with urban sprawl and other developing planning that are outside of business and population hubs, that not everyone can participate in economic gains and social mobility. If there's no public transportation sector, then there's no way for people to get a job. There's a robust discussion we could have just around that aspect and that issue, of course, but I don't want to take away too much from what the speakers have to do. So we'll go ahead and get started with the panel discussion. Our first, and I will say each speaker has 20 minutes to speak and to make a presentation. We will take a few clarifying questions between speakers as long as time allows, because we'll be respectful of everybody's time. But we do plan on holding these questions to a minimum just to ensure that we have enough time for discussion at the end. We ask that you type these questions into the chat. We will be monitoring them and we will do our absolute best to get to every single one that we can. But I've already listed out the expectations for making sure that we're prioritizing everyone's voice, not just one person's or just a few people's voice. So please don't be bashful. Please use the chat. It only enhances the engagement and the education and insights that we can provide during this event. So we'll go ahead and get started. Our first speaker is Sonia Brady, and she is the Northern Virginia Advocacy Manager for the Coalition of Smarter Growth. Sonia teams with the Coalition's Northern Virginia partners to achieve shared goals for healthy, livable communities. She's on the board of the Fairfax Alliance for Better Bicycling and Fairfax Families for Safe Streets. She spends a lot of time in Fairfax, where she lives in Falls Church in a car-light household that is able to bike, walk, and take public transit to get around the neighborhood and region. She enjoys the outdoors, and she has worked to promote active transportation, outdoor recreation, and environmental sustainability. And I can tell you, Sonia is like all the speakers where really their bio could just be for a very long time, but people are probably tired of hearing me speak before now. So Sonia, please take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Let me share my screen and get my presentation up here. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm excited to be here. Tonight, we're going to talk about walkable, transit-oriented communities for a sustainable environment. For those of you who aren't familiar with CSG, we work here regionally in the DC area advocating for walkable, bikeable, inclusive, and transit-oriented communities as the most sustainable and equitable way for the DC region to grow and provide opportunities for all. And just for some context, sprawling development gobbles up undeveloped lands, clearing forests and farmlands, and creating places dependent on driving and significant road infrastructure. When land uses are spread out like this, it requires driving for most everything. The distance between homes, work, and the places people need to go are often too far to walk or bike, and the roads create major barriers for anything but driving. And that driving requires acres upon acres of impervious surface for parking lots with minimal, if any, stormwater management controls. And pushing that new growth to the outer limits of our region eats up the undeveloped lands and forces people into longer commutes, which often come right through our closer in communities. And regionally, this creates a cycle of road expansion that clears significant tracts of forest, adds more impervious surface for the roads themselves, creates major congestion and all the air, water, and climate pollution that goes along with it. So in 2002, CSG launched a blueprint for a better region, calling on local leaders to plan for a more sustainable future by focusing development in the right places, in walkable, transit-oriented communities near metro stations and along commercial corridors served by good transit. By focusing growth in already built environments with the infrastructure in place, we can reduce the amount of car-dependent sprawling development that eats into our undeveloped natural lands. This vision has been endorsed by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, aka COG, and our local jurisdictions over the years as part of several of its plans helping to direct how the region should grow. In 2010, COG approved the Region Forward, which set a vision for the region focused on creating a more prosperous, accessible, livable, and sustainable metropolitan Washington, D.C. region, right? And so these are really great ways, and glad that the local jurisdictions have really gotten on board with this vision. Now, Arlington County is certainly a leader in the region on this front. You know, they started planning the Roslyn-Ballston corridor and these transit-oriented communities back in the 70s. And so you can take a look here and all the metro lines along that Roslyn-Ballston corridor, but also down in the Pentagon City, Crystal City, and then down towards the county line that way. They were the first to set a vision and a plan to accommodate new growth by providing homes close to transit, providing access to jobs, in neighborhoods with opportunity. And in the time since this plan was developed, Arlington has continued infill development in key corridors. They had a major planning effort for an inclusive mixed-use Columbia Pike and are now working on the planned Langston Boulevard along the newly named Langston Boulevard corridor. And so this is always a fun picture, you know, so when this planning started back in the 70s, this is what Roslyn looked like. You know, and so with that vision and a plan, this is how it looks today in the 2000s. As the plan has been built out, the county has been able to accommodate much of its new growth by allowing the greatest density closest to transit and walkable communities where people are able to walk, bike, use transit to get to their, you know, for their daily needs. And also tapering down the heights and density into surrounding areas, the surrounding neighborhoods helps to sort of maintain that residential feel and not overwhelm things and creates a really great balance. So, you know, CSG works regionally, and as we talked about these regional plans, we're working on these walkable transit-oriented development all around the region. And so in Fairfax, similarly, that's creating walkable, I'm going to say TOD, transit-oriented development near transit stations along the orange and silver lines and the blue and yellow lines down in the silver Springfield and Alexandria areas. The first TOD really came online in '99 here in Fairfax around the Dunloring-Merrifield area, which has really become a huge success. And then CSG, along with the Sierra Club, won the Vienna Metro TOD in the early 2000s. And it continues as we sort of progress and these transit station areas redevelop. And just this year, we're really excited that the Fairfax County Board passed a plan to transform acres of parking lots at the West Falls Church Metro Station in concert with the City of Falls Church effort to really create a new inclusive, walkable, bikeable community in West Falls Church. And, you know, next up is going to be the Hennington Metro. So bit by bit, we're really starting to tackle and build out these transit-oriented areas. You know, and a big one in Fairfax has been Tyson's. It's been undergoing a major transformation from a very car-centric suburb, if you will, you know, focused around shopping centers and whatnot, into this walkable transit-oriented development built around the Silver Line stations. The Tyson's plan was passed in 2010. So just in these 10 years, you've seen a lot of progress. There's a lot going on, and there's still a lot that's still coming together. And so it's sort of in the mix, and people always be like, oh my gosh, the walkability or these issues, but it's part of that transition, and we continue to sort of evolve and make these things work, and it's been great. Montgomery County's doing similar work around TOD, around their Purple Line and their bus rapid transit up Route 29. Prince George's, similarly, really starting to focus on and advocating for transit-oriented development around their metro stations and along the Purple Line. And in DC, they recently passed their comp plan amendment that really is going to allow for more housing and more affordable housing in DC across all of its wards, not just certain wards, right? So to really be more equitable. And this is a cut of the map showing the Connecticut and Wisconsin avenues, and that focus around TOD around their metro stations, even in an urban environment like that. So, housing is a real critical part of accommodating growth, right? And creating a more sustainable region. We often say that housing in the right place is a climate solution. And we're facing a regional housing shortage because of the limited supply, which has been driven up costs considerably and forces people to move farther and farther away to find something that they can afford. And this has continued to put development pressures on outer lying areas, forcing people into those longer commutes and exacerbating equity issues. In 2019, COG set regional housing targets to address this shortage, which also recognizes the importance that these new homes need to be close to transit, housing in the right places, and available to low and middle incomes. And just this month, they voted to recommit to these targets. So this is a really great step forward as we start to move for greater equity and more housing opportunities. CSG continues to fight for affordable housing across all of the jurisdictions in the region. Accessory dwelling units. We promote ADUs as a way to provide more housing opportunities that blend well into our residential communities. They're often less expensive because of their smaller size, and they can help to provide a source of revenue for homeowners to help offset property costs. And in a time when, the pandemic, when you want to have, aging parents closer to you or have other opportunities for family members, these really provide great housing opportunities. And of course, the missing middle housing types like duplexes, triplexes, and townhomes are great ways to provide more housing opportunities at different price points. And you can see here from this diagram, on the left, from the single family detached homes, and to the right, where you have your mid-rise multifamily homes, there's a lot of opportunity to provide more housing types that are really fit very well into a residential community and different price points. But I don't want to go into too much detail here because I know other panelists will be talking more about the housing. But I did want to touch upon it because it really is a part of this regional solution that we're striving for. Because it's not just cars that drive up CO2 emissions. It's also the zoning that doesn't allow for more diversity of housing types that are close to transit and jobs. So I want to dig in a little bit about the land use transportation climate connection. The transportation sector is the largest contributor of carbon pollution in the US. So, within that transportation sector, privately owned vehicles and medium and heavy duty trucks contribute 82% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So even if we do 100% electrification of vehicles, but we don't stop sprawl or reduce vehicle miles traveled, we're going to still see we're not going to get to the targets we need. And in fact, we're going to see a major increase in electricity demand that could very well overwhelm our renewable energy capacity or potentially risk conversion of farms and forests. So we need to sort of tackle all of these things together, right? So what's it going to take to reduce our on-road transportation emissions to meet our region's targets? A year ago, the Washington region adopted a new climate plan with the goal of a 50% reduction in climate emissions by 2030. And that plan included transportation strategies and electric vehicle goals, but it didn't really quantify how much the region was going to have to reduce its driving. So prompted by advocates like CSG and some local elected officials, the Transportation Planning Board agreed to undertake a study to really provide more specifics around that front. And the draft findings were released just this week. And it offered different scenarios and strategies, but ultimately, we're going to need to cut per person driving by up to 20% by 2030. And to do that, some of the strategies noted are shifting travel to other modes, bringing jobs and new housing closer together in near transit, making communities more walkable and bikeable, pricing congestion and parking, and continuing telework. We're also going to need to meet or even surpass the Biden administration goal for electric vehicles. That means like half or more than half of new cars, SUVs, and pickups being sold need to be electric by 2030 to start meeting our targets. So this is a chart from CSG's Green Place report, which I think really speaks well to how vehicle miles traveled can be reduced by the type of density and housing that we have. Here you can see in this chart that vehicle miles traveled per household in an urban center like DC or more dense mixed use center, the Roslyn-Ballston corridor is the lowest. It's about 25 per this chart miles per day. Next up is that suburban multi-use, sort of like Mosaic, or a close-in urbanizing center, thinking Tyson's or Silver Spring, closer to 30. But both of those are significantly lower than the regional average, which is 45. And here's another chart, another graphic from that report that really shows the correlation between vehicle miles traveled and carbon emissions. The blue is the regional average, and the orange is what the vehicle miles traveled and the CO2 emissions are for those walkable transit-oriented places. And you can see how significantly lower they are. And this great map, it's pretty shocking. This is the CO2 emissions per capita from transportation. And this is from Cal Berkeley. They have a cool climate website with these various maps. And you can see that the CO2 emissions are lowest in those more compact areas that are walkable, bike friendly, and have greater proximity to high capacity transit. And the further out from transit we go, and where land uses are more spread out, carbon emissions go up significantly. And even if we look really closely into Arlington here, North Arlington, above the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, is red. It's pretty, it, as we know, has more car dependency in that area. But as you head south, if you look between the Crystal City and Old Town, much less carbon emissions. And even going along the Columbia Pike corridor in South Arlington, you see a lower per capita emissions. And this could be that, it has really good bus access, and that the corridor and the folks living there might have lower car ownership. But it's a really telling sort of picture here of what we're struggling with. Now, this pie chart sort of speaks to how people access transit and thinking about how do we get away from having to use cars at all, right? And so in looking at this, here's a comparison between the Roslyn-Ballston corridor and then East Falls Church out to Vienna. Now, these are 2007 numbers, so this sort of have the outer lying suburbs, so outside of East Falls Church, have been seeing more TOD coming online, but when this happened, they weren't online yet, right? So in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, you can see in those more walkable communities, 73% of people are able to walk to Metro. But then out from East Falls Church out to Vienna, where it's less compact, a majority have to drive. And so, obviously, as I said, this is changing as Fairfax builds out more TOD around its Metro stations. But I also think it speaks to the need for those first and last mile connections to Metro, like bike share, scooters, and other micro mobility options, because those are a great way to get folks to Metro and to bus stops without actually having to drive, and helping us to reduce those vehicle miles traveled. Now, I know this is a really busy slide, but I think it has some really telling information. This is from the Center of Neighborhood Technology, and they have this Housing and Transportation Affordability Index. What they've done here is combining both housing and transportation costs really provides a more comprehensive look at affordability. And when you start to look at these numbers, Arlington actually spends less on these combined costs as compared to Loudoun. Because in the more dispersed areas, people have to have more cars and they have to drive more. Arlington spends less than these compared to Loudoun. Oh, I already said that. Not surprisingly, transit ridership is significantly higher in Arlington compared to Loudoun, and Arlington produces half as much greenhouse gas emissions than Loudoun does. And so I think that's very telling as well. So, here is a sort of strip mall example of, these before and after images show the connection between land use, transportation, and the big impact on safety, access, and economic vitality of a community. So this is sort of the before with the after. And now what we see here is that compact development with buildings close to the street's edge creates a sense of place and street level activity that is more inviting and comfortable. Underutilized surface parking and single-story buildings can be replaced with multi-story mixed-use buildings. This offers ground level retail and more homes that can be provided above that can also include mixed income options. The safer and more complete streets with wider sidewalks and a narrow road are much more inviting for people to bike and walk places. And that type of environment is what actually encourages folks to get out of their cars and move around in a different way. And I want to speak to the street trees. Street trees not only give shade and comfort to people who are trying to walk and bike on these hot summer days, but it helps to reduce the heat island impacts. Like, we need to have trees. And part of this redevelopment, if you look at the lower portion, there's barely any trees. And so as part of good design, you can incorporate trees, you can green infrastructure. A lot of the new buildings will offer updated stormwater management where the parking lot did not have any before. And so there are a lot of environmental enhancements that can come along with really good, smart design like this. There we go. And by designing communities to be mixed use and walkable, you can really have a range of transportation options that work well. And this allows people to live car-free or car-light, as I was able to do because I live within a bikeable distance to East Falls Church Metro, and helping to reduce overall vehicle miles traveled significantly. So we have a choice how we want our region to grow and how we want to do it in a more sustainable way. And so the question is, how are we going to do that and which path are we going to take? So thank you very much. That ends my portion of the presentation. Let me stop sharing here.
Sonia, thank you. I think that was very robust. I do have a question from Barbara. I wanted to see, you mentioned regional congestion as a big aspect of why this policy can help improve and reduce pollution. And maybe this is a little bit outside of the scope because this overlaps with other policies, but the question is, are there any plans for regional congestion pricing for neighborhoods? And then in parentheses, to cut down on cut through traffic.
Well, with regards to the congestion pricing, because I focus further out in Northern Virginia, haven't really grappled with that topic, but I believe they are considering it and looking at it in the district and in other areas. So, I don't want to say too much there because it's just a little outside of my knowledge zone. The cut through traffic, I understand is a big concern with a lot of folks. I always like to point out that a grid of streets actually helps to disperse traffic throughout, instead of putting everybody on these major arterials and getting us all stuck in traffic. I think the thing for me, with cut through traffic is how people are driving, right? Traffic calming, making sure people are safe and our streets are safe. And people, they're designed in a way that controls speeds, is a big part of helping that. And making sure that there are legitimate ways for us to move through our communities, both driving, but also by getting people out of cars. So if we have a grid of streets, we can get people using transit, we can get people walking, biking, and using other modes to help reduce the amount of people that are actually having to drive.
Thank you. And I think it's important also that I do not believe localities have the power to put a pricing on congestion right now, because the General Assembly has not given them explicit powers. Virginia is one of those weird localities can't do anything without state approval first types of states. We're very strict on that. So this may bleed into state level policy. So I just wanted to make sure that we're covering all the context of Barbara's question. So thank you, Sonia. I don't actually see any other clarifying questions for now. So I know you're going to stick around and be part of the discussion at the end, but really appreciate you handing off to our setting up a good foundation before we get to our next speaker, who is Alice Hogan. And she is a consultant with Alliance for Housing Solutions. Alice has an extensive history of working in public policy and social service industries. She has been a member of Arlington Housing Commission for 12 years, is a past member of the board of directors of Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing, and currently serves on the Resident Services Committee of that organization. She is a former presidential management fellow at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. She is a graduate of the Virginia Commonwealth University. I'm a Richmonder, so that's really nice to hear. And a graduate school of social work. Excuse me, I didn't finish the entire title. And also the University of Virginia and Washington Liberty High School. So education bona fides speak for themselves, and your experience was great. So we're gonna leave it to Alice now.
Okay, well, thank you all. It's great to be with you this evening. Let me share my screen and we will move forward. Right. Okay. Can you see my slide there? Can you guys see it?
Yes, looks
We
good.
can, yes. Thank you, Alice.
Okay, just want to make sure. Okay, so, oh, why are we on that slide? Hold on just a second. Not at the beginning. There you go. Again. Oh. I don't know what's doing that. Well, those are some pretty pictures. I'm not sure why. I'm not going to go. That should be the thing. Start. Okay, is that better?
Yep, that's great.
All right, great. Thanks for your patience. So yeah, so this evening I'm going to talk about housing supply, affordability, some other aspects of housing in Arlington and the region, and how it impacts our environment. So I do work with the Alliance for Housing Solutions. We're a nonprofit here in Arlington, and we work on increasing the supply of affordable housing in Arlington and the region through public education, policy development, and advocacy and innovation. This is a slide, and some of these will be a little repetitive of Sonia's, but to kind of drive home that idea that we are a very rapidly growing region. And COB, that we've mentioned before, the Council of Governments for the metro area, has estimated that we need over 300,000 new housing units in the next 10 years to accommodate folks coming to our region for the growing job market. The problem is that in the early 2000s, as you can see, we had our recession, and so the bottom dropped out of the housing market. And as we move toward today, we've never really recovered in construction and housing development. And so we're in a real crunch. There's not enough housing, and there's a very high demand. So as we said earlier, that the The COG thinks that, we need about 60,000 more units in Arlington alone. And they recommend that most of these units across our region be in activity centers and be affordable. So that's what we're really missing. So Arlington alone is looking for 60,000 new, and where will we put them? As a region, this is a kind of a complicated slide, but if you were to pick Arlington or let's say Loudoun, you can see the amount of demand by income level across the bottom. So orange is Loudoun. So they are looking for housing at all these income levels. Or Arlington, we're yellow and green. So we're very, very small. So that's why we're littler, but we are, this is a significant amount of housing demand pretty much across the income spectrum. So across the region, and for an example here in Arlington, we are losing affordability in our market rate units on a very drastic level. We're losing around 1,000 units per year to redevelopment, mostly of luxury units. So the market is very tight for rental. And we have a similar thing going on in ownership where, prices are going up to doubling in value, in sale price over the past 10 and 15 years. So the market, no matter what type of housing you're seeking, is very, very tight, and that increases cost. So what we need to do, in part, to solve some of this is to create a more of a variety of housing options and closer in options that will help preserve our diversity, provide inclusivity, and of course, sustainability in our communities. This is an example of our growth here in Arlington. On the left half of the screen, you'll see this is the size of the households that are growing. So you can see the majority of the households are growing. They're smaller households. They're not large households of generations past. So shrinking households, and over here by age, we have a massive bubble of boomers, right? Baby boomers who are going into their senior living that they need. And that's accessibility, it's smaller, it's walkable. So those are the kinds of demographics that we're looking at needing to respond to. So smaller households and older people. This is what we have in Arlington now. This slide is about missing middle, but I'll first point out to you on the far left and the far right. On the far left, the light blue shows how many units are occupying this dark blue, which is the land itself. So what it means is that almost 3/4 of our land in Arlington is being occupied by only 1/4 of the housing units. And if you swing all the way to the other end, you have almost half the units in Arlington utilizing less than 10% of our land. And so lots of people in tiny places and very few homes in most of the land. And in the middle is what we really lack. So if we're looking for gentle density or modest upzoning and infill development, these are the areas we don't have in Arlington. And it's similar across most of the region. Very few townhomes, very few duplexes, triplexes, up to small multifamily. And so utilizing our land a little differently and offering opportunities for more than one household to occupy that lot or that building can bring more people in without further development and without sprawl. So when we look at this map, it's talking about racial injustice and the history of Arlington. First, let's look at the yellow. Like I showed you on the first chart, almost 75% of our land in Arlington is being held and zoned exclusively for single family detached homes. So look at the yellow, you can see almost everywhere you could live in Arlington, you can only build a single family home. Okay, and then over the generations, this kind of zoning came in almost 100 years ago. And over the generations, you can see the economic and racial impact. Because if we look at the hatched portions that are overlay, almost all of the yellow and a few other places, you can see that folks who are white are representing these zones by 70 or more %. So people of color and lower income people are basically priced out of like half to 3/4 of our residential zones in Arlington. This is another way of looking at it, and it is a microcosm for Arlington, but I think it's very similar for the region. So on the bottom, this is an income scale. So if we were to look at the average white household makes this amount of money and can pay this much in rent, and that family could reside anywhere in Arlington. This top portion was not calculated for some reason, but we know that the upper north and northwest portion of Arlington is the most expensive in the county. So this one shows that the average white family can rent any place they would like to. They have the income to do so. Asian comes down to a lower income, and they have a few areas that would be out of their price range by average rental cost. We move left to Hispanic or Latino households, even fewer options. And to our Black Arlington neighbors, we have the lowest income average, and those families can only afford to reside in 3 small zones within our tiny county of Arlington. So we see the geographic and the racial impact of antiquated zoning. We won't watch this video tonight, but if you haven't seen it, I really recommend it. We did produce it, but it's being used by Challenging Racism. It's being used in the Arlington Public School System and many other places. It's about 7 minutes long, and it talks about the history of zoning and the impact on our racial makeup in Arlington. It has some great images, historic images, and really ask these questions. How do we move forward with this history behind us? Let's talk a little bit about affordability. Housing affordability is defined by a household not needing to spend more than 30% of its income to pay for either rental or mortgage housing costs. And the reason we need to stay within that zone, obviously we all have a budget. There are so many other demands on a household. If a lot of people are paying a lot more than 30% of their income, there's a real impact in every community. And so we see a diminishment in our diversity where people can't afford to stay. They will move out of an area that they can no longer afford. That area itself suffers in its economic success because we don't have the workers close by, and we can't keep up small business and other services that we need between banking and childcare and construction. Our public servants, entry-level public servants that have a tough time living in our community when they have too much of a housing burden. And then the folks who do try to remain often have health and well-being, negative health and well-being outcomes because they're working 2 and 3 jobs. They're very focused on survival. They can't thrive. They can barely survive. And of course, as we discussed before, there's an environmental impact. When folks can't live close in where they can afford, they're seeking housing they can afford. And that seems to be further and further away from job centers, from opportunities, from good schools. And so families and individuals end up commuting for hours at a time and causing environmental degradation, and also putting pressure on our existing infrastructure. And so new developments further out create further sprawl, and that ends up raising forest land, putting many more roads out there, creating a lot of problems with our stormwater, our Chesapeake Bay efforts, and the list goes on. So you saw this slide before with Sonia, so I won't go over it too long, but basically that's what we're saying is that transportation is our biggest carbon impact. So if we can limit our transportation and get out of our cars and live close by where we need to be during our day, that 15-minute zone around our homes where we can live most of our lives using transit and foot and bike. Those are the ways to try to limit as individuals and as a community our impact on the carbon footprint. So, and I just want to stress that, people say, well, what if I build a green home in, Prince William County or Loudoun? Well, the greenest home is the home that doesn't require the people who live in it to commute too far. So even if you have a completely green home, far out, the impact is more than a regular home close in. This is just a question. These statements were made by a group. Zoning needs a complete rethink, and that's across our nation. Antiquated zoning laws are having an impact, negatively impacting our communities, and they're crippling our housing choice by limiting opportunity, reinforcing segregation, driving up the cost of housing, and unfairly favoring single-family, low-density housing at the expense of the environment and our communities. And it's even contributing to the worsening of our climate crisis, as we've mentioned. So who said that? The American Planning Association. So it's not just tree huggers, it's not just housing advocates, it's planners looking at our country and saying most of this was planned 50 to 100 years ago, and it's not meeting today's needs, and it's having a negative impact on our communities and on our environment. So in terms of affordability, we can look at affordability from two sides, the supply side and the funding side. So tonight we won't look at funding of truly affordable units means subsidized financing through different mechanisms. But tonight we're talking about supply and what can our communities, what can we do to spur more supply. We need different types of supply. We need it in the best and most environmentally friendly locations, and we need it at a lot of different price points. So people aren't needing to leave these core areas for our sprawling exurbs. So when we're talking about development, it can be all kinds of development that can help with the environment. So obviously these transit heavy areas and corridors are a place for high rise and very dense development. And Arlington, as an example, has done a very good job kind of densifying in a very community friendly way. It's organized and it's around our transit opportunities. And now we have one more opportunity along the Lunston Boulevard corridor to take a good look at that stretch of 2.5 miles of land and say what would make it, transit friendly, walkable, affordable, good for small business, bring in affordability both in small businesses, but in housing. So we're taking a look at that corridor now and hopefully following some of the best practices that were discussed in the prior presentation. And so then you step down, as we do in Arlington, to less dense or maybe small multifamily. And then now we're exploring in Arlington this idea of missing middle. So what kinds of structures that would sit on almost the exact footprint of a single family home, or possibly, two lots that might be merged, 2 family homes where you could put 4, 6, 8 families in that same footprint, living, in and among a neighborhood where there's very little impact. So we look at missing middle, and then we also have ADs, which are accessory dwelling units that are legalized in Arlington now, where folks can occupy a small unit, either attached or in the basement, or even detached in the backyard of an existing home. So we saw this map or design before, and I'll just point out what Sonia had said. So in Arlington, as an example, and really in our region, we mostly have a whole lot of single family homes and high density development, and really almost nothing in the middle. So you can see, for example, here, 6 or 10 households, 12 households might occupy this same corner or section of a neighborhood. But once you put smaller units and more compact housing together on basically that same footprint, so not taking away too much green space or knocking down trees, you can use height and what they call affordable by design to create housing that has very little environmental impact. Folks are still close in, and they're using the same land in a more creative way. It also benefits affordability. Now, these are not affordable as their own, because a lot of this will be new construction. The new construction isn't inexpensive. However, it takes the pressure off the total supply. So if people opt into those kinds of newer units, they're freeing up some of the older units that over time become more affordable. And these newer units, for example, and most especially in home ownership, the smaller unit will be much more affordable. So if you're trying to buy this small McMansion yourself, you're going to spend $1 to $2 million. If that's out of your budget, You might be able to step over here into a small multifamily and buy a 1,000 or 2,000 square foot condo in a building, and that's much more affordable to folks. So missing middle housing or more dense infill housing has a lot of benefits. And so these are what we've talked about. Shared opportunity, bringing folks who have been pushed out and purposely left out of certain neighborhoods and access to jobs there, schools there, etc., are given a new opportunity when we allow some infill, when we bring in gentle density. It also provides a lot more choice. We don't have a lot of accessible housing or ground level housing for our senior population or our folks with disabilities. We don't have a lot of small home ownership opportunities for families or smaller families and households that aren't looking for the massive home. So on that earlier chart, when we saw that 75% of our land is being occupied by 24% of our households in Arlington, that's showing us that about 1 in 5 households actually has children. So 70 to 80% of our households do not seek a large building on a large lot. That's not the kind of housing choice or hopefully ownership that they would seek. And so we need to expand those opportunities. It brings diversity to our neighborhoods in age, in economics, in race, and family makeup. Of course, the environmental components are there. We can use our land more wisely. We can redevelop surface parking lots that are causing runoff and dirty runoff. And once we get any kind of new development in, especially in a new zoning opportunity like missing middle housing that doesn't exist today, it's not a by right development. So the county can put some regulations around that development of what is your stormwater plan? What is your green plan? How many trees will you plant? What kind of construction are you going to use? So we can incentivize much greener development than what exists today. And of course, our seniors will benefit from this infill, walkable, accessible, ground level, and smaller units that we envision. So Alliance for Housing Solutions produced a series of videos explaining what missing middle was and looking at it from a variety of angles. And one of our angles was environment. So I encourage you to go to our other website, which is missingmiddlearlington.net. And you'll find these videos, including the one that discusses how missing middle and other infill, small and large density can help us protect our environment. And we have a blog on that same page that goes into a lot more detail called Smaller Homes, Greener Future. And it details, some of the positive aspects of density and infill development, tree canopy production in our larger region, energy efficiency. When we share walls and live together, we use less electricity and lose less energy. Walkability keeps us out of our cars. Diversity and the community builds up our opportunity to be together and look for joint solutions. And people can live closer in and not need to move to our excerpts. So as I mentioned, Arlington County is in the middle of a missing middle study. This is the website. You can Google it, or we'll be sending this presentation later. And I point this group of case studies and documents that the county produced, 4 or 5 very digestible reports, 4 or 5 pages long, that really go into the detail of what is housing supply, what we need, what the demographics that are changing, how the current supply does not meet the current population, that our supply was really built in the 50s and 60s and 30s. And today's population seeks different things, needs different things, wants different things. And so how do we accommodate this growth while also protecting our environment and meeting the needs of today's diverse community? As I mentioned, the Alliance for Housing Solutions has this missingmiddlearlington.net website with a variety of resources and information for you, including the videos. And then this is our website, which is allianceforhousingsolutions.org. And yeah, that's the end of my presentation. I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to answer any questions. And I hope that sets it up for Kristen Dorsey, who follows me with a more in-depth Arlington and regional and political perspective. So thank you.
Thank you, Alice. That was wonderful. I appreciate everything you'd said, and I really appreciate especially the highlighting of the equity and racial justice implications of ignoring the realities of discrimination that have been taking place, and as well as just the income realities of communities of color. So that is one of the huge aspects that the Sierra Club is certainly trying to highlight of the intersections of environmental justice and racial justice throughout all of our work. So really great groundwork laid in there. And we will include a link in the follow-up email to the video. Encourage everybody to watch it. It's fantastic. I watched it earlier today. So now we're going to go ahead to our final speaker. I think Alice set up already a great introduction to speak about, to let everyone know about what Christian will be talking about, but I'll just give a quick bio. Our final speaker is Christian Dorsey, who was first elected to the Arlington County Board in 2015 and is now serving his second term. So congratulations on re-election. He served as chair in 2019 and serves as liaison to several commissions and advisory groups, including the Neighborhood Complete Streets Commission. Sorry, I got a little tongue tied there. Christian has represented Arlington on the board of directors of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, or COG. We might be hearing a lot of acronyms tonight, so COG for that one, since 2016. Currently, Mr. Dorsey serves as Arlington's member on the Transportation Planning Board, also TPB. That may show up again in the presentation. So outside of public service, Mr. Dorsey engages as a policy and communications consultant supporting progressive organizations in realizing their missions. And prior to joining the board, Christian was a senior leader at the Economic Policy Institute, a think tank that promotes economic policies that foster broadly shared prosperity. So again, I will say this one more time. All of our speakers tonight have a very long resume that was just too impressive for me to speak out loud when I compared my career to them. So we had to condense them down for timing purposes, but we're really glad to have Christian here, and please feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much, Tim. I do appreciate it. And I get the privilege of going last, which means I can actually be brief due to the very wonderful and comprehensive presentations that Sonia and Alice brought to the table, which I want to largely associate myself with, and which frame really what I'm going to focus on tonight, which is really the regional context for where we are with a lot of these initiatives and policies. Of course, I will talk about my own community of Arlington where appropriate, but then I do want to get into some of the conversation around the headwinds or challenges that we have in actually meeting these transformative goals that have been outlined by Sonia and Alice, and that are really explicit in the Sierra Club's infill policy. And I actually want to start there for a minute because I want to lift up and really applaud the infill policy as a body of work. It is an excellent explication of really how smart growth goes beyond a land use paradigm that's designed to prevent sprawl and to accommodate future growth, but really outlines it as a precedent example, of how essential it is for us to realize our larger goals of climate resilience, environmental sustainability, as well as equity, as has been largely discussed. It is an excellent way to take something which had been understood through a fairly narrow lens, but unpacking how it's actually a key to broader goals that through its nature creates a more inclusive sense of people buying into the program, if you will. So let me just move forward with it because I do know we want to spend some time and reserve some time for discussion. I am certainly proud that Arlington County has adopted many of the principles and plans and policies that are explicit in the infill policy and some of the perspectives of the Coalition for Smarter Growth and Alliance for Housing Solutions. You can find those in our comprehensive plan, in our various sector, smaller area, and even site-specific plans. But I'm further encouraged that it's not just our county working with other counties, but that our region is beginning to come together and recognizing the necessity for us to engage in this work thoughtfully and collaboratively with full deference to the fact that regions have their own, jurisdictions within the region have their own areas of particular concern. We've referenced the Council of Governments, of which I have been nominated as the 2022 chair, and the work that we did that I am especially proud of as it pertains to regional housing targets, which I won't go over again since it's been adequately addressed. But suffice it to say, it gives us a number, and a number is important to understand what we are solving toward so that we don't continue to do jurisdiction by jurisdiction planning with absolutely no understanding of how that's going to impact the regional housing market in terms of affordability. We certainly know that we're not going to be able to do anything within our reasonable power, even with the full embrace of the private sector, to drive down housing costs, but we very well can eliminate what has been our structural unaffordability by not producing enough housing to meet the expected and realized demand. By doing that, while at the same time ensuring that that housing leverages the existing investments that we've already made in transit-oriented communities and explicitly naming what our targets need to be in terms of affordability for people in lower and middle income brackets, we at least have named what problem we are trying to solve. Secondly, the work that we've done with transit-oriented communities, and specifically to identify the high-capacity transit station areas in our region that we should maximize, is incredibly important. As we think about limited dollars for expansion of what would be my desire to have higher quality premium transit, even more saturated in our region, one of the things that we can do in light of that current reality is to maximize the investments that we already have. And these high capacity transit station areas are really necessary to realize the whole idea of transit-oriented communities. And we certainly know, and I won't belabor all of the benefits, but reducing greenhouse gas emissions and creating livable communities is really the essence of what maximizing investments in that area will bring. Regionally, we are absolutely doing the work on understanding what should be our shared climate goals. Many of you probably have followed the work of COG and the TPB and know it hasn't been entirely painless, but at the same time, getting a great understanding of what is needed on a region-wide at-scale level is going to be essential in moving us forward. And really what COG does and what these regional bodies do that is value added to our region is providing the analysis, providing a forum for best practices, and hopefully creating a community of people who realize they're all in it together to hopefully generate and spur the necessary local action to produce change. And one area where change has certainly been present is in our understanding regionally of equity and how to apply analyses to principles of equity and how that can translate into policy. And over the last couple of years, COG has identified a framework that it will use within our entirety of planning, equity emphasis areas that look throughout our region at areas that are disproportionately composed of people who are low income and or racial and ethnic minority groups. And putting those on a map and beginning to understand for all of our jurisdictions, what are the commonalities of these regions in terms of public actions and public investments, and what we might be able to do to remediate the lack of investment and policy action that has historically been the norm. Now, taken together, all of that work that we're doing regionally and all of the plans and policies that jurisdictions may have on their own or that groups like the Sierra Club may bring to the civic discussion, taken together, these are transformative policies. They will produce transformative change. But I do want to underscore that it's not going to be as easy as adopting a broad policy. From an implementation perspective, this is going to require thousands of decisions hundreds of discrete actions that are all going to be subject to some sort of a process in order to implement. So as we sort of think about that, we can understand that there's going to be an extreme amount of time that's going to be required to see this through. And as we think from an equity perspective, bringing people into a decision-making, bringing people into decision-making when we know that things are going to take quite a lot of time is exclusionary as opposed to inclusionary. And that's going to be something that we're all going to have to grapple with if we truly desire and endeavor to bring people into the conversation who have historically been marginalized. Because it's going to take a lot of time, it's going to mean that this work is going to have to transcend leaders, people who may be on this panel right now, or people who may be in this conversation on the call. And so to have something that sustains and endures despite a change in leadership absolutely requires something that has substance and is firm and is able to be a guide to people who have positions of authority and decision-making well into the future. And of course, whenever there's a process, there are going to be people who have opposing points of view. And those opposing points of view cannot be ignored, should not be ignored, and need to be well integrated into how the ultimate solutions can actually lead to something that is sustainable. So what that means for all of us is that there needs to be a significant commitment to the front end work, the kind of work that we're doing as it relates to missing middle housing in Arlington, to put together the research compendium that Alice alluded to that has a number of white papers that gets into the depths of the issue, that we engage in community and public engagement so that we can help people understand the implications of what is being talked about and to solicit their input on how it can be improved. It is absolutely going to mean that we have to not view this solely from the lens of what political victory can be attained at any point in time, to how we can forge a neighborhood, a community, a jurisdiction, and a regional consensus so that we can have sustained action. And it may also mean that we have to really rethink about our systems for how we get stuff done in this region. And once we are able to hopefully get that consensus in the community, to make sure that our systems of implementation are appropriately designed to actually follow through and to follow through efficiently and quickly. So I have a couple thoughts that I'd just like to introduce about some of these areas, because despite my identifying them as headwinds, I do believe that there are ways forward and ways that we should embrace. One, as it relates to consensus, we have to understand that in order to get any kind of consensus on issues such as what we're talking about that are complex and are interrelated with so many other things, it is absolutely going to require that we speak to as many people as possible, that we have an engagement for all approach, not just simply those who show up at meetings and who raise their hand to say, yes, I'm interested, but also that we find ways of letting people know who may not necessarily have expressed an historical interest, but who nonetheless are affected and who need to be included in the conversation somehow. It also means that we have to embrace and understand people who are opposed to these initiatives in total or in part. And I think over the years, I've developed at least a couple of thoughts about what drives some of that opposition. For many in our communities, people are concerned about change. And I'm not telling you anything that you already know, you don't already know, but I think we often have this institutional reaction to people who are concerned about change as being retrograde in their thinking and somehow needing to get with the program. I take a different approach to it. understanding change and what drives it is really going to be key if we're going to have any success in bringing people along. People are reluctant to embrace change for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are in fact retrograde. I don't want to minimize it, but for a great many, it's because change brings with it the possibility that something that they already enjoy and value, care about, and love will be changed in such a way that they will no longer care and love and value it. So we actually have to hear that, understand it, and begin speaking about these policy issues, not just for the benefits that they will bring to others who have been excluded, but for the positive benefit it will bring to people who are already there. And in fact, I believe to my core, a great number of the policies that we talk about tonight are not just for the benefit of those who have been shut out, but bring immense value to those who are already here. And we need to begin to articulate that on a regular basis. Another reason people are reluctant to embrace change is for fear that what they will lose, in addition to not being able to have what they value anymore, but that they will actually lose, that they will actually be worse off. And again, as we think about all that we have to gain from these integrated approaches to smart growth that is designed to accommodate a growing community more equitably and more sustainably, there is a lot there that everybody can win from, because the costs to the status quo are severe, even though we don't often have a good framework for quantifying them. But of course, we should take these concerns about change and, in my opinion, lead with responding to them with grace, understanding where they come from. And if they are in those buckets of being concerned about what's in it for me or what do I have to lose, respond honestly and openly and patiently so that those issues can be worked through. Now, for people who have retrograde issues about change because they don't like the fact that it will invite into their communities people who don't look like them or may not earn what they earn, that's a totally different conversation. I'm not endorsing, embracing, or otherwise saying that we should coddle that. I want to be very, very clear. But then there are other areas that present as headwinds, both in the way individuals think about these issues and also the way my colleagues think about these issues in the region, not in Arlington, but throughout the region. And I'll just put a few out there for discussion. As it relates to housing, unfortunately, in my opinion, not everybody in the region believes that housing affordability is a community-wide priority, that it ought to be a focus on their government policies and government investments. Some people desire to attract housing that is attainable for people of high incomes solely, or to only have housing types which would exclude lots of people who are currently finding housing a cost burden in our area. So number one, we do not have universal adherence to this as an operational value throughout our region. However, through the work that we're doing, COG and elsewhere, I think we're helping people understand the costs, the other impacts, the interrelated impacts that a lack of affordable housing has on areas that they do care about, as we think about transportation congestion, as we think about environmental sustainability. Once we're able to start speaking about these issues and the interrelated nature of all of them, we have a better opportunity for getting success in discrete areas that we know require attention. We also know that people are concerned about issues such as how will accommodating growth through missing middle and other forms of housing policy, how will that impact schools, school crowding? How will it impact my children, my grandchildren's education? I think there's a lot of conversation to be had there. There's a lot of analysis and research that can be brought to assuage those concerns, I believe, but we can't avoid the conversation. It must be had because it is a top line concern that people have. I think Sonia and Alice both did a great job of talking about how tree canopy, trees, we could rethink this, not from the standpoint of missing middle or upzoning or whatever you want to call it, bringing a degradation in our tree canopy, but all of the missed opportunities that we're currently not taking to reforest natural areas, to introduce street design that includes healthy, sustainable trees, to think about road design that is biophilic in nature and that could produce environmental benefit akin to the way we currently understand tree canopy. We're not engaging in that work. We're not doing that work to the degree that's required, not just to offset the concerns about will missing middle and other forms of upzoning reduce the tree canopy, but these are absolutely things that we need to do if we're going to meet our sustainability targets. There's also a couple of other headwinds, and I'll just get these briefly so that we can get into a little discussion. There does exist a bias against people with lower incomes. And so as it relates to housing, as it relates to mobility, there still are within institutions in the national capital area, a bias against people with lower incomes, a belief that somehow these will cause a drain on already limited and constrained public resources. And I think that is a robust area for us to engage in conversation. I have a personal belief that there's a systemic bias there, whereas we easily can quantify the amount of subsidy that people may get through our departments of human services or the cost to send their children to school. But because we don't have a framework for quantifying all of the other ways in which public goods subsidize the lifestyles of people, we inadequately account for the way in which we are all, everyone in the community, no matter how high their income and no matter how expensive their house, being subsidized to enjoy their best life in the national capital region. And then lastly, of course, I'll just talk about dollars, fundamental dollars, finding ways to fund the necessary investments to get us to the solutions that we've already identified. We are going to have to come up with better and more sustainable ways of funding priority actions in these areas. As Arlington, for example, thinks about transformative change to our Richmond Highway corridor by changing the land use and retrofitting the infrastructure to make what was formerly known as Route 1, bringing that to grade and thinking about all that we could do to make that walkable and safer from a transportation perspective, we're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars. And of course, we know that funding these things is beyond the reach of many communities when they think about necessary investments. But just because that is the case now doesn't mean that we shouldn't orient ourselves toward figuring out how to seek those sustainable funding opportunities in the future. I can't tell you how many great ideas die on the cutting room floor simply because at the point in time people are analyzing it, they don't see a path forward with the money. And we've got to get away from that thinking if we're actually going to ever achieve these necessary changes. I'll tell you, for Arlington, the conversations around bringing Route 1 to grade would have been just in that bucket before we had a couple of happenstance circumstances along the way with Amazon and state partnership, which have now made it a reality. And I'll just leave it at that since I know we're running short on time, and look forward to any conversations and questions.
Thank you, Christian, Dorsey. We really appreciate it. I don't know, people of all of your stature, I just want to say your first and last names as a sign of respect. So yeah, I appreciate all the speakers, and that was a great, wonderful perspective on the political realities, regional realities, et cetera. So we will get moved now to our discussion question. Alice, I think you had something to say regarding some concerns that were raised about how urban density can impact negative impacts, et cetera. I can read out the concern if you'd like, but if you have it covered, I'd be.
Yeah, I've got it. Thank you,
Great.
Tim. Just to follow up on what Christian was saying, to answer someone's question, this idea of change. So I grew up in Arlington. So I've watched 50 years of change in Arlington, and it's been drastic. And there are moments you don't want to let go of things, but I've come to, accept that it is everything evolves, right? Every community evolves, and we are evolving. So one of the things about zoning changes, missing middle, these other efforts, is that we can get in front of the change and we can drive the car a little bit, not to use that metaphor, but to figure out the planning and to envision what we want for the next evolution of our community. So there's a lot of concern, as Christian said, about schools and pressures on our infrastructure. The thing that I've come to is that our population is growing, and we cannot dig a moat and pull up that's not a possibility. And so we know the pressures are coming on housing, on infrastructure, on schools. And so by not building or not opening up our zoning opportunities, we don't stop the pressure on schools. We don't stop there's not a stopping, there's a responding. And so what we need to do is work together, pull in experts, and figure out what are the best responses to these challenges that meet our community's values. So I think trying to kind of embrace that change is here, and that housing is really part of our infrastructure. And we need to keep our infrastructure responsive to community needs and to population growth and to environmental impact. It's part of our planning, and we can't not build it and expect the other issues to then dissipate. They're not going anywhere. It's all interconnected. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Alice. I think, everything you just said is wonderful. And I would just say, I think it's easy to get caught up in these discussions. We have kind of a zeroed in view of a particular policy, that it may be folks make the assumption that this is not in addition to a bunch of other advocacy efforts and policies that we are trying to evaluate to make sure that there's community investments and improvements for everyone to be a part of. And I think, the fact that you're a a lifelong Arlington is part of that. And I think everything you just said was just such a great way to describe how this process is not looking at these things as universal or as a silver bullet, but as part of a longer journey on the road to progress and equity. So thank you for that. And I wanted to go ahead and get to some of the questions about some that we've received from the chat. And I'm sorry, I just got a random message that I don't want to, but I did see, what is your advice for people who want to support smart growth and reduce sprawl? And what are a couple of things they can do? And this is for all of the speakers.
I'll kick it off, I guess. So I appreciate that question, John. And I think the first thing that I would recommend is to help us deinstitutionalize these conversations. And by deinstitutionalize, I mean taking government as an institution as the loudest speaker on these issues. For all kinds of reasons, even in a progressive region and a progressive community like Arlington, where people, I think, have an affinity for government, there's still a natural resistance that people have towards government institutions trying to initiate and carry conversations through from beginning to end. So to the extent that you can work to deinstitutionalize things, and by that, I mean, make sure you reserve time not to just talk to government folks and not just talk to other organized entities, but to figure out how we start to get this into the neighborhood, how we get this into folks that you just may know casually who are not necessarily engaged or involved, and begin to talk it through. It's really old school organizing at its best. The neighbor that you speak to infrequently, but that you can have over for coffee, talk to that neighbor. The person that might be resistant, but nonetheless like spending time with you. Take advantage of some of that time and share some of these goals. Don't invite them to a meeting, just talk to them person to person. And I kind of have this vision of lots of those activities sprouting through our community as the way we generate the consensus I think we need.
I like that that response, and I totally agree. I think, my first thought was, for the individual to sort of engage and speak up and both, you know, if there's somebody who's already knowledgeable on these topics, to really participate in these processes and to vocalize, because I think, you know, we want to have good discourse during the meetings, and there may be opponents, but there are supporters. And if you're supporting something and you want to see the change, it's really important that you speak up, because others are going to hear you, and they're going to hear what you have to say. They're going to listen to you. You may not change the opponents, but there might be the silent listeners who are hearing you. And I think part of that is speaking to your neighbors and talking locally. You know, I would always suggest, you know, next door is always a scary place, but sometimes just putting in some thoughts that, like, hey,
Yep.
I don't necessarily agree, this is why, and just leaving it at that and not really getting into it, but putting yourself out there. And I know it's uncomfortable sometimes, but to just try to be who you are, to meet people where they are, your neighbors, and to have the conversation about why it's important to you. And you might be surprised that others feel similarly, or maybe just weren't aware.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I would add too that, you know, advocacy in lots of different areas can work. We have some listservs that through AHS that focus on missing middle or affordable housing. You know, in order to be an advocate, you need information. So participating, getting that information yourself, and then using it in the ways you all have mentioned, I think is great. And also looking for natural allies. You know, when we plan well and when we have our community's values, you know, the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you know, main values that we all share, the planning will come behind it. For example, you know, we have a racial reckoning going on right now. How do we undo what was done? Well, planning and intentional rezoning is a way to undo the wrongs that have been done to this point, you know. So environmental, this is another group, you know. When we build again, do we really need a 6,000 square foot single family home for one person? Or could we advocate for 2 or 3 families to live in that, in a duplex or a triplex, in that square footage or even less, where we have, you know, absorption and bushes and trees, you know. So things that we want, we can find them in the way we are evolving. You know, there are a lot of school advocates out there. Well, we know today we need more schools and better schools. And that need will continue. So we don't have to have a battle between housers and school people. We actually, these things can be held in common. So I think seeking those allies and advocating together are ways to kind of advance a common agenda.
Thank you to all of you for that response. We do have an important question, I think, that was just posted in the chat from Samuel. And it's, how do I respond to those who say that new development makes gentrification worse? I think that is a key thing that most cities around the country and in Virginia, especially, I mean, I live in Richmond, we're kind of on the front lines of a lot of these things, is right on the top of minds for people who are advocates and care about the same issues, Alice, that you were speaking about. So I think you're probably the best person to respond first, but of course the other panels should jump in.
Well, I think I'd look at it from 2 ends. I mean, I'd say in many of the places we're talking about, gentrification is happening. It's already happening, even in neighborhoods that are, you know, what do we call them? Emerging, you know. Well, when a neighborhood is emerging, some people are being pushed out. So for me, one of the biggest responses is supply. Because people are coming. The less supply we have, the higher the demand, and people will buy anything at any price. And so that's gentrification, that, you know, lower income people will be priced out. So to me, supply is really important in that context. And a lot of the new supply will be, you know, unaffordable to a lot of people. But the smaller every unit is in something new, the more, you know, financially attainable it is. So we're not talking about, you know, for the most part, new development will not be for very low income people unless it has a subsidy. But for all those middle income earners who don't even, you know, qualify for a subsidy, if it's smaller, it's going to be more affordable to them. You could buy a 2 1,500 square foot condo in a building, or, a set of, in a flat of 3 flats, but you can't buy a multi-million-dollar home on your own. And then if you want purchasing, you're leaving the county and going where you can purchase. So we need to create supply and diversify our supply. And then where we can, we advocate for subsidies to come in to assist people who are truly being displaced. I guess I'd look at it kind of from 2 ends.
And I just add quickly that public investment is really key to all of this. Clearly, if you have neighborhood change and revitalization that's solely guided by creating incentives for private change, you are likely going to see this result. But that doesn't have to be. That is by the typical design. You can design it in another way. Just this past week, Arlington County engaged or entered into a relationship with a private developer to preserve the long-term 99-year affordability of what is our largest naturally occurring affordable housing community in Arlington. And the only way that that was possible was because we became a part of the deal. And we're going to be able to guide the not only redevelopment of that property, but also hopefully the improvement that has as a prerequisite all of the existing units that are in place now will at least be preserved in that number in the long-term planning for it. So yeah, what may be the historical example is not a naturally occurring feature of revitalization. It's only because people have allowed it to be so. It's actually quite simple to counteract those trends, even though it's expensive.
And I want to just really quickly throw in there, I don't know necessarily all the policies of the local jurisdictions, but a lot of new development, new transit-oriented development have inclusive zoning. So where there's these trade-offs where the developers can get increased density by providing affordable, or in Fairfax, they have a workforce dwelling unit policy. So different income levels. And that becomes part of how, depending on the housing type that's being created and the type of development and how big it is and whatnot. But some of these inclusive, these IZ policies, these inclusive zonings can offer a mix of incomes in new redevelopments to help offset that displacement issue.
Thank you. I feel that was a very good, robust answer for that question, which is really just a really complicated issue that has, or at least making it seem complicated. I feel like after you 3 just spoke, it's not so much anymore. Real quickly, because I know this is one of the main hot topic issues or hot topic components of urban density, and that's, can we expand our green space or tree canopy at the same time that we add density?
I could touch on that a little bit. It kind of follows up on what Sonia was saying, because at least in Arlington, one of the things we consider with missing middle specifically, but in other areas too, when we introduce something new, that's an opportunity to incentivize the person who is, entity that's going to benefit from that to give back what the community needs, right? That little trade-off that happens. So for example, on a smaller scale, if someone buys a home, a 1,500 square foot home, which is our average existing home in Arlington, they can demolish that and take down every tree on that lot because they have the by right ownership to do what they want. But if that same purchaser wanted to build a duplex on that, and we provide this new zoning opportunity, so we're not ending single family zoning. If this happens at all, we will introduce additional zoning options in those communities. So in that particular case, we might be able to put some things in the zoning regulation that are new. And if you choose to opt in, well, then what will we get back? On the larger scale, on a corridor, it's going to be, stormwater, improvements. It's going to be how much green space is on your total lot. These different things that we can bring our values to the change. And so in a single family, that's another example. They can cut down every tree they want. But if we start to talk about the envelope and what they're going to get if they're doing something they could never do before, that's our opportunity to put something in that wasn't there before. And those are the values that this generation can add that were not in place over the generations before this. I don't know if that answers, but.
And Alice, I would just say that that was an excellent answer to that question. And when we think about Arlington specifically, I don't know how representative we are in the region, but given that in the areas that are not devoted to single family zoning, often redevelopment is occurring on parcels that were very much designed to be auto-centric in terms of accessing them. In many ways, redevelopment brings a wealth of sustainability improvements that were not there otherwise. And when we think about the single family home communities where I think this concern is most often articulated, it must be noted that the status quo of these homes being redeveloped is that the footprint is maximized and lots are clear cut. So I think what Alice is talking about, while we haven't exactly figured out what it looks like, this to me holds great promise compared to the status quo of being able to not only preserve remaining tree canopy, but to create incentives for improved plantings and growth.
Not to belabor the point, but you're so right in that, Christian, because if we think about people who purchase now, Arlington land is so valuable. They want to maximize their benefits and what the profit they will make. Well, right now they can only do one thing on almost 75% of our land here. They don't have another option. So to max out their profit, they are going to put that big box house on as much of that land as zoning will allow. And so in order to disincentivize that, we have to actually give other options that today do not exist. And so someone said something about townhomes in the chat earlier. Well, we do have a few townhomes. They're in very specific areas, and it's the same thing. They are maxing out these townhomes that are like 25 feet wide and 4 and 5 stories high. That is not a townhome in my mind. When we talk about missing middle and we're looking for introducing, we're saying piggyback 1 or 2 story with 1 or 2 stories on them and narrow like 12 feet. So in the same place, you might get 2 or 3 maxed out townhomes. You could probably double up and get 6 or 8 families on that same lot, and you didn't disturb any more land, and yet people reside in that place. So the other environmental thing I'll mention, and then I'll stop, is that retrofitting is another opportunity that can come forth potentially with these new missing middle opportunities. So someone who already owns a big home but doesn't need it anymore today cannot chop that into 2, 3, or 4 homes. That's not allowed. But if we allow something like that, that won't even be new construction. Imagine the energy savings of not knocking down, rebuilding, more concrete, more everything, reconstructing the interior of a large building so that more than one family could reside in there is another kind of environmental approach to increasing density without disturbing a neighborhood.
Well, great. Thank you all for this discussion and for staying 15 or looks like almost 15 minutes earlier. We really do appreciate you giving this time. I don't think I should have the last word since I wasn't the person who's the real host of this event. So I'll pass it over to John, I think.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks everyone. It's just been a fabulous session, amazing, collection of expertise. And, as someone who tries to follow these issues, I still learned a ton from this session, and it's just been excellent. And I'll let everyone get on with their night, but we really appreciate it and look forward to working with you all over time on these issues. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks. Have a good one. Enjoy your holidays.